The morning sun cast long shadows across the stone corridors of Windsor Castle as young Prince Louis walked beside his royal guard, Officer James Mitchell. The 5-year-old prince clutched a small toy car in his hand, his usual cheerful demeanor noticeably absent. James had been assigned to the young prince for nearly 2 years now, and he prided himself on reading the subtle changes in the boy's mood. Today something felt different. Something felt wrong. Louis dragged his feet against the polished marble floors, creating a soft, shuffling sound that echoed through the empty hallway. His bright blue eyes, usually sparkling with mischief and curiosity, seemed dulled and distant. James noticed how the prince kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear behind them at any moment. The guard's trained instincts began to tingle with concern, though he couldn't yet pinpoint the source of his unease. They were heading toward the private family quarters after a morning education session. The castle was quieter than usual, with many of the senior royals attending various engagements across London. It was just another Tuesday or so, James had thought when he began his shift that morning. He had no idea that the next few minutes would change everything he thought. He knew about his role in protecting the young prince. As they approached the grand staircase leading to the upper residential floors, Louis suddenly stopped walking. His small hand reached out and grabbed the edge of James's uniform jacket. The gesture was urgent, almost desperate. James immediately knelt down to the boy's eye level, his professional training kicking in as he scanned the area for any potential threats. The corridor was empty. The usual staff members were going about their duties in distant parts of the castle. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the young prince's face had gone pale. Louis's bottom lip began to tremble. He looked down at his shoes, expensive leather ones that had been polished to perfection that morning. His fingers twisted the fabric of James's jacket nervously. The guard had seen the prince upset before over small things, a broken toy or being told he couldn't have sweets before dinner. But this was different. This was fear. Real, palpable fear that seemed far too heavy for such young shoulders to carry. James gently placed his hand on the prince's shoulder. He spoke in the soft, reassuring tone he reserved for moments when Louis needed comfort rather than formal protection. He asked if everything was all right, if someone had said something to upset him, if he was feeling unwell. The questions came naturally, born from genuine concern rather than mere duty. The prince shook his head at each question, but still wouldn't meet his eyes. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of footsteps from a floor below and the soft ticking of an antique clock mounted on the wall. James waited patiently. He had learned early in his assignment that rushing the young prince never worked. Louis needed time to gather his thoughts, to find his words, especially when something truly bothered him. But as the seconds turned into a full minute, James felt his concern deepening into something closer to alarm. Finally, Louis looked up. His eyes were glassy with unshed tears that threatened to spill over at any moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, so quiet that James had to lean in closer to hear the words. What the prince said made James's blood run cold. Louis told him that he didn't want to go to the family gathering scheduled for that afternoon. More specifically, he didn't want to see Tom Parker Bowles, Queen Camilla's son from her first marriage. James felt his pulse quicken. Tom Parker Bowles was a food writer and critic, someone who occasionally attended family functions but wasn't a regular presence in the young prince's daily life. The mention of his name in such a fearful context immediately raised red flags. James kept his expression neutral, his training preventing him from showing the alarm bells ringing in his mind. He asked Louis why he didn't want to see Tom. Keeping his voice gentle and encouraging, the prince's next words came out in a rush, as if he'd been holding them back for too long and couldn't contain them anymore. He told James about the last family gathering 3 weeks prior, when Tom had cornered him in one of the castle's side rooms. Louis described how Tom had asked all the other children to leave, saying he had a special game to play with the prince alone. The way Louis's voice shook as he recounted this made James's protective. Instincts surged to the forefront, Louis continued, describing how Tom had made him sit on his lap, which the prince said felt uncomfortable and wrong. Tom had whispered things to him, telling him that this was their special secret and that he shouldn't tell his parents or anyone else. The prince said Tom had touched his hair and kept calling him special names that made him feel weird inside. Louis couldn't fully articulate what had happened, his young vocabulary struggling to capture the complex feelings of discomfort and violation he'd experienced. As James listened, his face began to lose color. His mind raced through protocols, through procedures, through every training session he'd ever attended about protecting the royal children. But nothing had quite prepared him for this moment. For hearing a 5-year-old describe what sounded disturbingly like grooming behavior, his hands usually steady and calm, began to shake slightly as he maintained his crouched position in front of the prince. Louis wasn't finished. He told James how Tom had given him sweets and told him that if he'd told anyone about their special time together, something bad would happen. Tom had said that nobody would believe a little boy anyway, that adults always believed other adults instead. The prince said he'd been having nightmares ever since. Dreams where he was trapped in dark rooms and couldn't find his way out. He'd been too scared to tell his parents, Princess Catherine and Prince William, because Tom had made it sound like telling would cause big problems for everyone. The young prince's tears finally spilled over, running down his cheeks in small streams. He told James that he'd tried to be brave, tried to forget about it, but the upcoming family gathering meant he'd have to see Tom again. The thought of being in the same room with him, of possibly being left alone with him again, was too much to bear. That's why he'd finally found the courage to speak up, to tell someone he trusted. James felt his professional composure cracking. His jaw clenched involuntarily as rage and protective fury warred with his need to remain calm for the prince's sake. He pulled Louis into a gentle hug, letting the boy cry against his shoulder while his mind worked through what needed to happen next. This wasn't just about following protocol anymore. This was about protecting a child who had trusted him with something deeply traumatic. After a moment, James pulled back and looked Louis directly in the eyes. He spoke clearly and firmly, making promises he fully intended to keep. He told the prince that he believed him, that what Tom had done was very wrong, and that Louis had been incredibly brave to tell him. He assured the prince that he would never have to be alone with Tom again, and that he was going to make sure the right people knew what had happened so they could keep Louis safe. The relief that flooded Louis's face was immediate and heartbreaking. The boy had clearly been carrying this burden alone for weeks. Terrified and confused, not knowing who to trust or whether anyone would believe him, James stood up, taking Louis's hand firmly in his own. He made a decision in that moment that would set off a chain of events throughout the royal household. He activated his radio and called for immediate backup, using the code that indicated a potential threat to a royal family member's well-being. Within minutes, the corridor filled with other security personnel. James spoke quietly to his supervisor while keeping Louis close to his side. He could see the confusion on his colleagues' faces, the questions forming about why an emergency protocol had been activated when there was no visible intruder or physical threat. But James didn't care about the questions or the potential consequences of his actions. All that mattered was the frightened child holding his hand. The supervisor, a woman named Sarah, who had 20 years of experience in royal protection, immediately understood the gravity of the situation from James's brief explanation. Her face went from confused to horrified to coldly professional in the span of seconds. She got on her phone and made several calls, her voice low and urgent. James heard fragments about notifying the Prince and Princess of Wales immediately, about securing the afternoon's guest list, about ensuring Tom Parker Bowles not be permitted entry to any royal residence until further notice. Louis stood pressed against James's leg, watching the flurry of activity around them with wide eyes. James kept one hand on the prince's shoulder, a steady, reassuring presence amid the sudden chaos. He explained to Louis in simple terms that these people were all here to help, that they were going to make sure he stayed safe, and that his parents would be told everything so they could protect him too. The prince nodded slowly, some of the tension leaving his small body. For the first time in 3 weeks, he didn't feel alone with his terrible secret. Someone believed him. Someone was taking action. Someone was going to make sure the bad thing didn't happen again. As they waited for Prince William and Princess Catherine to arrive, having been urgently summoned from their engagements, James felt the weight of what Louis had revealed, settling over him like a heavy cloak. This wasn't just about one incident in a side room. This was about trust, about power dynamics, about how easily a child could be manipulated by an adult authority figure. James thought about all the times he'd seen Tom at family gatherings, always appearing charming and appropriate. The idea that such darkness could hide behind a public persona made him feel sick. He wondered if there had been signs he'd missed. There had been other moments when Louis had seemed uncomfortable that he'd dismissed as childish mood swings. As footsteps echoed in the distance, signaling the arrival of the prince's parents, James took a deep breath. The immediate crisis was being handled, but he knew this was just the beginning. The revelation of what Tom Parker Bowles had allegedly done to Prince Louis would send shockwaves through the royal family. Questions would be asked. Investigations would be launched. And James would be there every step of the way, ensuring that the brave little boy who had trusted him with his darkest secret would never be let down again. Prince William arrived at Windsor Castle within 40 minutes of receiving the urgent call. His face was set in stone, the usual warmth in his eyes replaced by something cold and dangerous. Princess Catherine was right beside him, her composure barely masking the fury and fear warring beneath her carefully maintained exterior. They had been briefed on the basics during the frantic drive back, but hearing the full story directly from their son would be something else entirely. James led them to a private sitting room where Louis waited with Sarah and a child psychologist who had been summoned immediately. The room had been chosen specifically because it was one of Louis's favorite places in the castle, filled with comfortable furniture and warm lighting that might help him feel safe enough to speak. When Louis saw his parents, he ran to them with the desperate speed of a child who had been holding himself. Together by a thread, Catherine dropped to her knees and caught her son in her arms, holding him tightly against her chest. William knelt beside them, his large hand cradling the back of Louis's head. For a long moment, the three of them simply existed in that embrace, parents and child united in a bubble of safety and love. James watched from his position near the door, feeling both like an intruder on an intimate family moment and deeply grateful that he'd been the one Louis had trusted. When they finally pulled apart, Catherine's eyes were red but dry. She would not allow herself to break down, not when her son needed her to be strong. William's jaw was clenched so tightly that James could see the muscle twitching beneath his skin. The future king looked like a man barely containing volcanic rage, and James felt a moment of genuine concern for what might happen when William eventually confronted Tom Parker Bowles, the child psychologist. Dr. Emily Richardson stepped forward with gentle professionalism. She explained to Louis that she was someone who helped children talk about difficult things, and that she was there to listen if he wanted to tell his story again. Louis looked uncertainly between his parents and the stranger. Catherine stroked his hair and told him that it was okay, that Dr. Richardson was safe, and that Mummy and Daddy would be right. They're with him the whole time. What followed was one of the most difficult hours James had ever witnessed in his career. Louis, with frequent pauses and prompts from Dr. Richardson, recounted everything he'd told James and more. The additional details that emerged painted an even more disturbing picture. Tom had apparently tested boundaries gradually over several family gatherings, starting with innocent-seeming hair ruffles and shoulder touches, before escalating to the lap-sitting and whispered secrets. Louis described how Tom had shown him pictures on his phone during one of their encounters, though he couldn't articulate clearly what the images had been. He mentioned how Tom had asked him strange questions about whether he liked being touched, whether he'd told anyone about their special games. The grooming pattern was textbook, and everyone in the room recognized it for what it was. This hadn't been a one-time lapse in judgment. This had been calculated, predatory behavior. Catherine's composure finally cracked when Louis described having nightmares. A single tear escaped down her cheek before she quickly wiped it away. She pulled Louis closer and told him over and over that he'd done nothing wrong, that he was so brave for telling them that they would make sure he was safe. William had gone pale, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair with enough force that his knuckles had turned white. Dr. Richardson carefully documented everything, her pen moving steadily across her notepad. She asked questions in a way that didn't lead or pressure Louis, simply allowing him to share what he remembered at his own pace. James could see the professionalism and care in her approach. the way she validated Louis's feelings while gathering the necessary information for what would inevitably become an investigation. When the session finally ended, Dr. Richardson spoke quietly with William and Catherine while Louis sat exhausted on his mother's lap. She explained that Louis showed classic signs of trauma from grooming behavior, but that with proper support and therapy, children were remarkably resilient. She stressed the importance of believing him, of reinforcing that none of this was his fault, and of maintaining as much normalcy as possible in his daily routine while the adults handled the larger situation. William thanked her with barely controlled emotion in his voice. Then he turned to James, who had remained a silent presence throughout the entire session. The prince extended his hand, and when James shook it, William's grip was firm and grateful. He thanked James for being someone Louis felt safe enough to confide in, for acting quickly and appropriately, for believing his son without hesitation. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was enormous. After Dr. Richardson left, promising to return the following day to continue working with Louis, the focus shifted to what would happen next. Sarah had already begun coordinating with the head of royal security to ensure Tom Parker Bowles would be prevented from attending any future royal events. But the larger question loomed over everything: what to do about the allegations themselves, and how to handle the fact that the accused was Queen. Camilla's son, William, made it clear that he didn't care about political sensitivities or family complications. His child had been harmed, and there would be consequences. He wanted the police involved immediately. He wanted a formal investigation. He wanted Tom Parker Bowles to face justice, regardless of what chaos it might cause within the family. Catherine stood beside him, her agreement written in every tense line of her body. The implications of what they were proposing began to settle over everyone in the room. Involving the police meant this couldn't be handled quietly or kept within the family. It meant media attention, public scrutiny, and inevitable speculation. It meant that Queen Camilla would have to face the horrifying reality that her son stood accused of harming her step-grandson. It meant King Charles would be caught between his wife and his son, between his stepson and his grandchild. But William was adamant. The days of protecting institutional reputation over individual victims were over, as far as he was concerned. His son's well-being and safety mattered more than avoiding scandal. If the monarchy couldn't protect its most vulnerable members, then what was it really worth? Catherine nodded in fierce agreement, her arms still wrapped protectively around Louis, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep against her shoulder. Sarah made the call to Scotland Yard's Specialist Child Protection Unit. She explained the situation with professional detachment, though James could hear the underlying tension in her voice. The officer on the other end of the line promised to send their most experienced detective immediately. Protocol dictated that allegations involving minors had to be treated with the utmost seriousness, regardless of who was involved, while they waited for the detective to arrive. William gently took his sleeping son from Catherine's arms and carried him to a nearby bedroom. He laid Louis down carefully, removing his shoes and covering him with a soft blanket. For a long moment, William simply stood there, watching his son sleep with an expression of such profound sadness and rage that James had to look away. The father in William wanted to protect his child from ever experiencing pain. The fact that he'd failed, that something terrible had happened under his watch, was clearly eating him alive. Catherine joined her husband, and together they stood vigil over their sleeping son. James heard Catherine whisper that they couldn't have known, that Tom had been manipulative and calculated, that predators were skilled at hiding their true nature. William's response was too quiet to hear, but James saw Catherine take his hand and squeeze it tightly. In that moment, there were just two parents devastated by what their child had endured. The arrival of Detective Inspector Sarah Morrison changed the energy in the castle. She was a woman in her early 50s, with kind eyes and an air of competent authority. She'd spent 20 years working in child protection and had handled numerous high-profile cases. She greeted everyone professionally but warmly, immediately putting Catherine at ease with her matter-of-fact approach. Detective Morrison explained the process clearly. She would need to conduct a formal video interview with Louis, which would require special equipment and a trained interviewer. She stressed that they would make it as comfortable as possible for him. but the interview needed to be done properly to ensure any evidence gathered would hold up in court. She also explained that they would need to speak with Tom Parker Bowles, that he would be informed of the allegations and given the opportunity to respond. William asked bluntly, what would happen if Tom denied everything? Morrison's response was honest. Without physical evidence or witnesses, cases like this often came down to credibility. However, she noted that Lewis's immediate disclosure to James, the consistency of his account across multiple tellings, the specific details he'd provided, all worked in favor of his credibility. She also mentioned that they would investigate whether there might be other victims. Other children who had been around Tom at family gatherings or other settings. The thought that there might be other children who had suffered similarly made Catherine visibly shudder. She asked how long the investigation would take. Morrison couldn't give a definitive timeline, but promised that child protection cases were treated as priority. She would begin by interviewing Louis the following day, then move on to speaking with everyone who had been at the family gathering where the alleged incident occurred. As the evening drew on and Detective Morrison left to begin organizing her investigation, William made another decision. He needed to inform his father, King Charles, before the news spread further. It was a conversation he was dreading, knowing how it would devastate both his father and Queen Camilla. But it couldn't be avoided. William preferred to control the narrative rather than have Charles hear rumors or incomplete information. James was present when William made the call, standing just outside the door of the private office. Even from his position, he could hear the sharp intake of breath when William told his father what Louis had disclosed. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, followed by Charles's voice asking shocked questions. William's responses were firm but respectful. He laid out the facts without embellishment, explaining that the police had been called and that Tom would be investigated. The conversation that followed was clearly difficult. James heard William's voice rise slightly as he insisted that Lewis's protection came before all other considerations. There was a painful moment when William said something about not repeating the mistakes of the past, about choosing the victim over the institution. Charles's response was inaudible, but whatever he said caused William's shoulders to relax slightly. Agreement, then, or at least acceptance of what had to be done. When William emerged from the office, he looked 10 years older than he had that morning. Catherine was waiting for him, and they held each other for a long moment without speaking. James remained at his post, professional and detached on the outside, but internally processing the extraordinary events of the day. He thought about how a simple morning walk had turned into something that would reshape the royal family. In a bedroom down the hall, Prince Louis slept on, temporarily free from his nightmares. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more difficult conversations, more steps in the long process of healing and justice. But tonight, he was safe, surrounded by people who believed him and would fight to protect him. James took up his position outside Lewis's door, settling in for what would be a long night of guard duty. As midnight approached, James reflected on the pale terror he'd seen in the young prince's face that morning. That image would stay with him forever, a reminder of why his job mattered. He wasn't just guarding buildings or managing crowds. He was protecting real people, vulnerable children who depended on adults to keep them safe. Today, he'd been there when Louis needed him most. He'd listened, he'd believed, and he'd acted. In the complicated world of royal duty and protocol, that felt like the most important thing he'd ever done. The following morning arrived, with gray skies and a tension that seemed to permeate every corner of Windsor Castle. James had remained on duty through the night, catching only brief moments of rest while other guards rotated through. He'd heard Louis wake twice from nightmares, heard Catherine's soothing voice as she comforted her son back to sleep. Each time, James had checked his watch and made notes in his security log, documenting everything that might be relevant to the investigation. Detective Inspector Morrison arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, accompanied by a specially trained interviewer named Rachel Chen who worked specifically with child victims. They'd brought equipment to set up a comfortable interview space, one that would allow Louis to be recorded without feeling like he was being interrogated. The room they chose was bright and filled with toys, designed to be as unthreatening as possible while still maintaining the professional standards. Required for evidence gathering, Louis was reluctant when his parents explained what would happen. He'd already told his story twice yesterday, and the thought of repeating it again to strangers made him anxious. Catherine sat down with him and explained that Rachel and Detective Morrison were people whose job was to catch people who hurt children. She told him that by talking to them, he would help make sure Tom couldn't hurt anyone else. The idea of protecting other children seemed to resonate with Louis in a way that his own situation hadn't. The interview took nearly 2 hours, with several breaks for snacks and bathroom visits. Rachel Chen was masterful in her approach, using age-appropriate language and allowing Louis to express himself through drawings as well as words. She had brought anatomically correct dolls that helped Louis demonstrate what Tom had done without having to find words for things he didn't fully understand. James watched through a one-way mirror, his heart breaking afresh at the innocence of the little boy, describing experiences no child should ever have. Particular details emerged during the interview that hadn't come out before. Louis mentioned that Tom had told him stories about special princes who kept secrets from everyone, making it sound like keeping quiet was a royal duty. Tom had apparently given Louis a small toy knight as a gift, telling him it was a reminder of their special bond. Catherine had thought it was a sweet gesture at the time, never imagining the sinister context behind it. The manipulation was sophisticated and calculated, making it clear this wasn't impulsive behavior. After the interview concluded, Detective Morrison met with William and Catherine to discuss next steps. She explained that based on Louis's disclosure and the consistency of his account, there was sufficient evidence to interview Tom Parker Bowles under caution. This meant he would be formally questioned about the allegations and would have the right to legal representation. She warned them that Tom would likely deny everything, that his lawyers would attempt to discredit Louis's testimony by pointing to his young age. William's response was cold and controlled. He told Morrison that his son was credible, that the details he provided couldn't have been fabricated by a 5-year-old's imagination, and that he expected the investigation to be thorough and fair. Catherine added that they had complete faith in Louis and would support him through whatever came next, regardless of how difficult the process might become. Morrison nodded approvingly, noting that parental support was one of the most critical factors in helping child victims heal. While the police began their formal investigation, the situation within the royal family was reaching a crisis point. King Charles had informed Queen Camilla the previous evening, and according to palace sources, she had been utterly devastated. Camilla had immediately tried to call Tom, but he hadn't answered his phone. Palace security had already been instructed to inform Tom that he was not welcome at any royal residence pending the investigation, but actually serving him with that notice proved challenging. Tom Parker Bowles had seemingly gone to ground. His London flat was empty, his phone went straight to voicemail, and his usual haunts reported not having seen him. This disappearing act only made him look more guilty in the eyes of those investigating. Morrison assigned officers to locate him, knowing that his evasion would work against him if the case ever went to court. Meanwhile, the rumor mill within palace walls was working overtime. Staff members who had been at the family gathering 3 weeks ago were being interviewed. Most hadn't noticed anything unusual, which wasn't surprising given how skilled predators were at operating in plain sight. However, one housekeeper mentioned seeing Tom and Louis go into a side room together. She'd thought nothing of it at the time, assuming Tom was just keeping the prince entertained. Another staff member recalled that Louis had seemed quiet and withdrawn after the gathering, refusing his favorite dessert at dinner. These small pieces of corroborating evidence, while not proving the allegations, helped establish a timeline and pattern. Detective Morrison was building a comprehensive picture of events, gathering statements from everyone who might have relevant information. She also requested access to the castle's security camera footage from the date in question. While cameras didn't cover private family areas for obvious privacy reasons, they might show Tom and Louis entering and leaving the side room, establishing opportunity. 3 days after Louis's initial disclosure, Tom Parker Bowles finally surfaced. His lawyer contacted the police to arrange a formal interview. Tom arrived at the station with an expensive legal team and an air of outraged innocence. He vehemently denied all allegations, claiming that any time spent with Louis had been innocent and supervised. He suggested that the young prince must have misunderstood friendly attention, or perhaps had confused him with someone else. Tom's interview strategy was to paint himself as a victim of false accusations motivated by family politics. His lawyers implied that there were tensions between Camilla and Catherine that might lead to fabricated allegations designed to damage the queen consort's family. It was a desperate and offensive tactic that infuriated William when he was briefed on it. The idea that his wife would put their traumatized son through this ordeal for political gain was so absurd it barely deserved acknowledgement. However, Tom made a critical mistake during his interview. When pressed about specific details, he initially denied being alone with Louis in the side room at all. But when confronted with the housekeeper's testimony, he changed his story, admitting they'd been alone but claiming nothing inappropriate had happened. This inconsistency in his account was exactly the kind of thing that damaged credibility. Innocent people don't need to adjust their stories when confronted with evidence. Detective Morrison also noticed that Tom seemed overly prepared for certain questions, as if he'd anticipated exactly what Louis might have disclosed. This suggested consciousness of guilt, an awareness that his behavior could be viewed as wrong. His answers became increasingly defensive when asked about physical contact, and he showed none of the shock or horror that would be natural if someone was genuinely falsely accused of harming a child. Back at Windsor Castle, life continued in a strange state of suspended animation. Louis was in daily therapy sessions with Dr. Richardson, who was helping him process his trauma and understand that he'd done nothing wrong. Catherine had taken time away from all public engagements to be with her son, while William maintained a reduced schedule, appearing only at absolutely essential events. The public had been told that the family was dealing with a private matter, but the rumor mill was churning. James continued his duties as Louis's guard, but their relationship had shifted. Louis now saw him not just as protection against external threats, but as someone who had saved him when he needed it most. The prince would frequently hold James's hand during walks through the castle, would ask him to check rooms before entering them. James understood these were trauma responses, ways Louis was trying to regain a sense of control and safety. One afternoon, about a week after the disclosure, Queen Camilla requested a meeting with William and Catherine. It was a conversation everyone had been dreading. Camilla arrived at Windsor looking haggard and years older than she had just days before. Her usual impeccable styling was noticeably absent, her hair simply pulled back, her face free of makeup. She looked like what she was, a grandmother devastated by accusations against her son and the harm allegedly done to her step-grandson. The meeting took place in a private sitting room with just the three of them. James was stationed outside the door and could hear raised voices at several points, though he couldn't make out specific words. What he did hear clearly was Camilla's voice breaking as she apparently wept. Whether she was crying for Louis, for Tom, or for the situation as a whole was unclear. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours, and when the doors finally opened, all three looked emotionally exhausted. Catherine later confided in her private secretary that Camilla had been torn between defending her son and believing her step-grandson. The queen consort had apparently asked to see Louis, to speak with him herself, but William had firmly refused. He'd explained that Louis was traumatized enough without being put in a position where he might feel had to defend his disclosure or confront his accuser's mother. Camilla had apparently understood, even as the refusal clearly pained her. The conversation had also covered what would happen if charges were filed. Camilla had begged William to consider Tom's reputation, his career, his family. William's response had reportedly been blunt. He cared about his son's well-being and safety. Everything else was secondary. If Tom was innocent, the investigation would prove that. If he was guilty, then his reputation deserved to be destroyed. Catherine had supported her husband completely, making it clear that their priority was Louis, not family politics. King Charles was struggling with his own impossible position. He loved his wife and wanted to support her during this awful time. But he also loved his grandson and believed that children must be protected above all else. Palace insiders reported that Charles had barely slept since learning of the allegations. Torn between these competing loyalties, he'd apparently had several emotional conversations with William, trying to find a path forward that wouldn't tear the family apart completely. The press had begun to sense that something major was happening within the royal family. There were whispers and blind items in gossip columns about serious allegations and family rifts. The palace press office was working overtime to prevent leaks, knowing that once the story broke publicly, it would dominate headlines for months. They were prepared with carefully worded statements, hoped to delay public disclosure until after the police investigation concluded. Detective Morrison was making progress. She'd uncovered that Tom had been investigated for suspicious behavior with a minor in the past, though charges had never been filed due to insufficient evidence. The victim in that case, now an adult, had been contacted and agreed to give a statement about her experience. While not directly related to Louis's case, it established a pattern of concerning behavior that prosecutors could use to show this wasn't an isolated incident. As the second week after Louis's disclosure drew to a close, Morrison met with prosecutors to discuss whether charges should be filed. The evidence was stronger than many child abuse cases, given Louis's immediate disclosure, consistent account, and the corroborating details. However, prosecuting cases involving very young children was always challenging. Defense attorneys would attack Louis's credibility, question whether a 5-year-old could reliably remember events, and suggest that adult questioning had influenced his statements. The prosecutors ultimately decided to move forward. Tom Parker Bowles would be formally charged with child abuse and grooming offenses. He would have to appear in court, and the case would likely go to trial unless he accepted a plea deal. The news hit the royal family like a bomb. This was no longer an internal matter that could be quietly managed. This was a criminal prosecution that would become public record, that would be reported by every news outlet in the world. James was on duty when William received the call from Detective Morrison, informing him of the charges. He watched the prince's face cycle through relief, dread, and determination in rapid succession. William thanked Morrison for her thorough work, then immediately went to find Catherine. Together, they sat down with Louis to explain in appropriate terms that the police believed him, or were going to make sure Tom faced consequences for what he'd done. Louis's response was telling. He asked if this meant Tom wouldn't be able to hurt other children. When his parents confirmed that Tom would be monitored and restricted even before the trial, potentially imprisoned if found guilty, Louis seemed to relax in a way he hadn't since the whole ordeal began. He wasn't concerned about revenge or punishment. He was worried about other children's safety. The pure-hearted nature of his concern made both William and Catherine's eyes fill with tears. That evening, as James stood guard outside Louis's bedroom door, while the prince slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, he reflected on how much had changed since that morning in the corridor. A 5-year-old's brave disclosure had set in motion events that would likely reshape the royal family forever. But more importantly, it had potentially stopped a predator and might save other children from similar harm. In James's mind, that made all the coming difficulties worthwhile. The news broke 3 days after the charges were filed. Despite the palace's best efforts to control the narrative, details of the case leaked to the press. By morning, headlines around the world screamed variations of the same shocking story. Queen Camilla's son had been charged with child abuse involving Prince Louis. The media frenzy was immediate and overwhelming. With reporters camping outside every royal residence and legal experts dissecting the case on every news channel, the palace issued a carefully worded statement expressing full support for the ongoing investigation and asking for privacy for all involved, particularly for the young victim. William and Catherine released their own statement praising Louis's courage and emphasizing the importance of believing children who disclose abuse. They made it clear they had complete faith in the justice system and would cooperate fully with the prosecution. The statement was brief but powerful, leaving no doubt about where they stood. Queen Camilla's response was more complicated. Her official statement expressed shock and sadness about the allegations. While maintaining that everyone deserved the presumption of innocence until proven guilty, she notably did not defend Tom's character or claim his innocence outright, which royal watchers interpreted as significant. Palace insiders leaked that Camilla was barely functioning, having locked herself away from all but essential duties, supported by close friends and King Charles. The public reaction was swift and brutal. Tom Parker Bowles' social media accounts were flooded with angry messages. His publisher dropped an upcoming cookbook, Restaurants that had featured his reviews scrambled to distance themselves from him. His reputation, built over years as a respected food writer, evaporated overnight. Whether or not he was eventually convicted, his career was effectively over. The court of public opinion had already reached its verdict. Meanwhile, Louis was being carefully shielded from the media storm. He didn't understand why there were so many reporters outside castle gates or why his picture was appearing on television news. His parents explained simply that people were talking about Tom's bad choices and that this was actually a good thing because it meant Tom would have to answer for what he'd done. They kept Louis's routine as normal as possible, maintaining his education sessions, his playtime, and therapy appointments. Dr. Richardson reported that Louis was making remarkable progress in therapy. Children, she explained, were resilient when given proper support. Louis was learning to understand that what happened wasn't his fault, that he hadn't done anything to deserve or encourage Tom's behavior, and that telling adults about scary or uncomfortable situations was always the right choice. He still had nightmares occasionally. They were becoming less frequent and less intense. The preliminary hearing arrived 6 weeks after the charges were filed. Tom appeared in court wearing an expensive suit, his legal team surrounding him like a protective barrier. He pleaded not guilty to all charges, looking defiant despite the cameras and crowds outside the courthouse. His lawyers immediately filed motions to suppress various pieces of evidence and to question the reliability of Louis's testimony, given his young age. The judge denied most of the motions but agreed to review the video interview. Procedures to ensure proper protocols had been followed. Louis would not have to testify in person at trial, thanks to British laws protecting child victims. Instead, his video interview with Rachel Chen would be played for the jury, and he might be asked follow-up questions via video link if absolutely necessary. This was a relief to William and Catherine, who had been dreading the idea of their son being cross-examined by defense lawyers. The thought of Louis being questioned about traumatic experiences by attorneys trying to discredit him had kept them awake at night. As the case progressed through the legal system, family relationships within the royal household became increasingly strained. Camilla and Catherine had barely spoken since the charges were filed. Family gatherings became awkward affairs where certain topics were carefully avoided. King Charles tried to maintain connections with everyone, but it was clear the situation had created divisions that might never fully heal. William's relationship with his stepmother had grown cold and formal, stripped of whatever warmth had developed over the years. The most painful casualty was the relationship between Louis and his grandfather, King Charles. Charles loved his grandson deeply, but found himself in an impossible position. Every interaction with Louis reminded him of the allegations against his stepson, creating a guilt and discomfort that was difficult to navigate. Louis, with a child's sensitivity to emotional undercurrents, sensed the change and became more reserved around his grandfather. It was heartbreaking for everyone involved. The trial date was set for 4 months after the charges were filed. In the intervening time, Detective Morrison's team continued investigating. They had identified 2 other potential victims, young people who had known Tom through various social connections and reported uncomfortable interactions with him years ago. Both agreed to testify, though their cases fell outside the statute of limitations for criminal charges. Their testimony would establish a pattern of predatory behavior that prosecutors hoped would strengthen their case. Tom's defense strategy became clear through pre-trial motions and statements. His lawyers planned to argue that Louis had misinterpreted innocent interactions, that his young age made him prone to confusion and suggestion, and that the high-pressure environment of the royal family had led adults to overinterpret normal behavior. They would paint Tom as a target of a vindictive family, willing to sacrifice him to protect their image. It was a risky strategy that essentially required them to discredit a 5-year-old abuse victim. The prosecution team was led by Eleanor Grant, a seasoned prosecutor known for handling sensitive cases involving children. She'd reviewed every piece of evidence multiple times and felt confident they had a strong case. Louis's immediate disclosure, the consistency of his statements, the corroborating testimony from other victims, and Tom's own inconsistent interview responses created a compelling narrative. However, she warned William and Catherine that jury trials were always unpredictable. especially in high-profile cases. As the trial approached, security around the royal family intensified. James's duties expanded beyond simple protection to include coordinating with police about potential threats from both supporters and opponents of the case. There had been disturbing messages sent to the palace from people who either blindly supported Tom or felt the royal family was conspiring against him. Everyone was on high alert, knowing that high-profile trials sometimes attracted dangerous attention. Louis remained remarkably resilient through it all. He'd formed a strong therapeutic relationship with Dr. Richardson and had learned coping strategies for managing his anxiety and fear. He'd returned to playing with his siblings and engaging in normal childhood activities. While the trauma had certainly affected him, his parents' unwavering support and his own brave disclosure had prevented it from defining his young life. He was, in many ways, teaching the adults around him about courage and healing. The trial finally began on a cold Monday morning in early spring. The courthouse was surrounded by barriers holding back crowds of media and curious onlookers. Tom arrived looking gaunt and nervous, his earlier defiance replaced by visible stress. The jury selection process took 2 days, both sides working to find 12 people who could fairly evaluate evidence in such an emotionally charged case. Finally, a jury of 7 women and 5 men was seated, and opening statements began. Eleanor Grant's opening statement was powerful and straightforward. She described Louis as a normal 5-year-old boy who had trusted an adult family member, only to have that trust violated in the worst possible way. She outlined the grooming process Tom had used, the careful boundary testing, the manipulation through gifts and secrets, and the threats to keep Louis silent. She promised that the evidence would show a pattern of predatory behavior that left no doubt about Tom's guilt. Tom's defense attorney, Marcus Whitmore, took a different approach. He acknowledged that something had clearly upset young Prince Louis, but suggested that the rush to judgment had prevented a fair examination of what actually occurred. He painted Tom as a loving family member who had been caught in a political crossfire, suggesting that misunderstandings had been amplified by family tensions and the high-stakes environment of royal life. He asked the jury to consider whether real roles, perceptions could be reliably distinguished from imagination or influence. The prosecution's case unfolded over 2 weeks. Louis's video interview was played for the jury. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom as the small prince described what had happened to him. The innocence in his voice, the way he struggled to find words for experiences beyond his understanding, made his testimony profoundly credible. Even Tom's lawyers seemed affected, though they maintained professional detachment throughout. Rachel Chen testified about proper interview techniques for children and explained how the video interview had been conducted without leading questions or suggestions. Dr. Richardson testified about trauma indicators in young children and Louis's behavioral changes after the incident. The housekeeper who had seen Tom and Louis enter the side room testified about what she'd observed, piece by piece. Eleanor Grant built a comprehensive picture of what had happened and why. Louis's disclosure should be believed. The 2 other witnesses who reported concerning dysphagia from Tom added crucial context. Though their experiences had occurred years earlier and involved different circumstances, the patterns were strikingly similar. Tom had groomed each of them with special attention, boundary testing, and attempts to create secretive relationships. Defense objections about the relevance of these witnesses were overruled, the judge determining that pattern evidence was admissible to show common scheme or plan. When the prosecution rested its case, court observers felt confident in a conviction. The evidence had been compelling and emotionally powerful, but trials always held surprises, and the defense case was about to present its own narrative. Marcus Whitmore called character witnesses who testified to Tom's good reputation and gentle nature. He brought in a child psychologist who raised questions about how young children's memories could be influenced by repeated questioning. Even when interviewers used proper techniques, Tom himself testified in his own defense, something his lawyers had initially advised against, but ultimately decided was necessary. He appeared emotional and sincere as he denied all allegations. He claimed that any time spent with Louis had been innocent and that he was devastated by the accusations. He suggested that perhaps something else had happened to Louis. something the young prince had confused with their innocent interactions. It was a delicate balance between defending himself and avoiding appearing to blame a 5-year-old victim. The cross-examination was brutal. Eleanor Grant systematically dismantled Tom's testimony, highlighting every inconsistency between his statements and other evidence. She confronted him with his interview responses where he'd first denied being alone with Louis. Changed his story when confronted with witness testimony. She asked pointed questions about the specific details Louis had provided. Details that seemed impossible for a child to fabricate. Tom's composure cracked under the pressure, his answers becoming defensive and evasive. The moment that likely sealed his fate came when Grant asked Tom why. If he was innocent, he had gone into hiding after learning about the allegations. His answer, that he'd needed time to think and consult with lawyers, sounded hollow. An innocent person, Grant suggested, would have immediately denied the allegations and cooperated with investigators. Tom's failure to do so suggested consciousness of guilt, an awareness that his behavior could be interpreted as criminal. Closing arguments were scheduled for the following Monday, giving everyone a weekend to prepare. James used the break to check in with Louis, who had been carefully shielded from details of the trial but knew it was happening. The prince asked James if Tom would have to go to jail if the jury decided he'd done bad things. James carefully explained that yes, if found guilty, Tom would face consequences for his actions. Louis seemed satisfied with that answer, returning to playing with his toy cars without apparent distress. Monday morning brought Eleanor Grant's closing argument. She reminded the jury of their responsibility to believe children who found the courage to disclose abuse. She walked them through every piece of evidence, every testimony, showing how it all pointed to one clear conclusion. Tom Parker Bowles had groomed and abused Prince Louis, had manipulated and threatened him, and deserved to be held accountable. The jury sat riveted, several members taking notes as she spoke. Marcus Whitmore's closing argument emphasized reasonable doubt. He argued that the prosecution's case relied too heavily on the statements of a very young child whose perceptions might be flawed. He suggested that the high-profile nature of the case had created pressure to convict regardless of actual evidence. He asked the jury to set aside emotional reactions and evaluate the facts objectively. It was a competent argument, but lacked the emotional power of Grant's presentation. The judge's instructions to the jury were detailed and careful. He explained the standard of proof, the elements of each charge, and the importance of evaluating credibility. He reminded them that the burden was on the prosecution to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt, but also clarified that reasonable doubt didn't mean perfect certainty. After 3 hours of instructions, the jury retired to deliberate. The waiting began. Back at Windsor Castle, William and Catherine tried to maintain normal routines while anxiety gnawed at them. They'd been warned that jury deliberations could take days or even weeks in complex cases. But they couldn't help checking their phones constantly, waiting for the call that would tell them the jury had reached a verdict. James maintained his position near Louis, ready to protect the young prince from any outcome. The call came after just 18 hours of deliberation. The jury had reached a verdict. William and Catherine rushed to the courthouse, arriving just as the judge reconvened court. Tom sat at the defense table looking pale and defeated, as if he already knew what was coming. The jury filed in, their faces solemn and serious. The foreman stood when asked if they'd reached a verdict. Guilty on all counts. The words echoed through the courtroom. Tom's face crumpled, and he seemed to age years and seconds. Camilla, who had attended every day of the trial despite the pain it caused her, let out a soft sob from her seat in the gallery. William reached for Catherine's hand and squeezed it tightly. Justice, it seemed, had been served. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, remanding Tom to custody immediately. As officers led him away in handcuffs, Tom looked back at his mother one last time. The expression of devastation on both their faces was profound. But William and Catherine felt only relief. Their son's disclosure had been believed. His courage had led to accountability. That was what mattered. At Windsor Castle, James was the one who told Louis the outcome in simple terms. The jury had decided that Tom had done wrong things, and he would face consequences. Louis nodded seriously, then asked if he could go play outside. The resilience of children never ceased to amaze James. Louis wasn't defined by what had happened to him. He was simply a little boy who wanted to play in the sunshine. The sentencing hearing brought maximum media coverage once again. Character witnesses spoke on Tom's behalf, painting him as a complex person who had made terrible mistakes, but wasn't beyond redemption. The prosecution emphasized the calculated nature of his grooming, the vulnerability of his victim, and the need for a sentence that reflected the seriousness of the crimes and protected other children. The judge delivered a scathing statement before announcing the sentence. He noted the breach of trust, the abuse of family connections, and the psychological harm inflicted on a young child. He acknowledged that Tom's profile and connections had likely made him believe he was above consequences. The sentence was 12 years in prison, with strict restrictions on contact with minors upon release. Tom would serve at least 8 years before being eligible for parole. The sentence sent shockwaves through both the royal family and the wider public. Some felt it was too harsh, destroying a man's life over allegations that came down to one person's testimony. Others felt it wasn't harsh enough, that someone who preyed on a vulnerable child deserved far worse. But most agreed that justice had been appropriately served, that the trial had been fair, and that Prince Louis's courage had likely protected other potential victims. In the months that followed, the royal family began the slow process of healing. Louis continued his therapy and gradually processed his trauma in age-appropriate ways. His relationship with his siblings remained strong, and his parents' unwavering support helped him understand that he was loved and safe. The nightmares became rare, then stopped altogether. He learned that speaking up about scary things was brave and right. Relationships within the wider royal family remained strained. Camilla and Catherine maintained cordial but distant relations, the bond between them permanently altered by the case. King Charles struggled with guilt over what his step-grandson had endured, and sorrow for his wife's pain. But slowly, with time and therapy for everyone affected, the family found a new normal. It wasn't the same as before, but it was functional and based on clearer boundaries about protecting the most vulnerable members. James continued as Louis's guard, but their relationship had evolved beyond mere professional duty. He'd been there for Louis's darkest moment, and had responded with exactly the belief and action the situation required. Louis trusted him implicitly, and James took that trust as the most important responsibility of his career. He'd seen firsthand how one person listening to a child could change everything. 2 years after the trial, Louis was a thriving 7-year-old, with no conscious memory of much of the trauma he'd experienced. Dr. Richardson explained that this was common with very young victims who received immediate support. The memories might resurface later in life, or they might remain buried. Either way, Louis had the tools and support system to handle whatever came. He'd been protected in the aftermath of his trauma in ways that would shape his entire life positively. The case had broader implications beyond one family's experience. It sparked conversations about child protection in privileged environments, about how predators often hide in plain sight among respectable families, and about the importance of believing children. Organizations working against child abuse used the case as an example of proper response to disclosure, praising how quickly Louis's report had been taken seriously and investigated. Tom Parker Bowles remained in prison, reportedly a model inmate who participated in treatment programs for sex offenders. Whether he genuinely understood the harm he'd caused or was simply trying to appear rehabilitated for parole hearings remained unclear. His mother visited him regularly, trapped between love for her son and recognition of what he'd done. It was a private pain she bore largely alone, unable to publicly defend him without seeming to dismiss his victim. For William and Catherine, experience had reinforced their determination to raise their children with emotional intelligence and clear boundaries about bodily autonomy. They'd already been intentional parents, but Louis's experience sharpened their focus on ensuring all their children understood they could always speak up about uncomfortable situations without fear of punishment or disbelief. It was a lesson learned through pain, but one they were determined would protect their family going forward. James Mitchell eventually received a commendation for his handling of Louis's disclosure. The recognition noted his immediate, appropriate response, his compassionate support of the victim, and his professional coordination with investigators. But James felt the real reward was seeing Louis happy and thriving, unburdened by the secret that had weighed on him so heavily. That morning in the corridor when a frightened prince had grabbed his jacket seemed like a lifetime ago. On a bright autumn day, 3 years after the initial disclosure, James watched Louis play football in the castle gardens with his siblings. The prince was laughing, competitive, completely engaged in the game. There was no visible shadow of trauma, no hint of the darkness that had briefly touched his young life. He was just a child playing, protected, and loved. Able to trust the adults around him because when he'd needed them most, they'd been there. As the sun set over Windsor Castle, casting long golden shadows across the ancient stones, James reflected on how different things might have been if Louis hadn't found the courage to speak up that morning. How many other children might Tom have harmed? How much deeper would Louis's trauma have gone if he'd remained silent? The what-ifs were endless and disturbing. But instead, a 5-year-old boy had been brave enough to trust someone with his terrible secret, and the adults around him had responded with belief, action, and unwavering support. Justice had been served. A child had been protected. And perhaps most importantly, Louis had learned that his voice mattered. Speaking truth to power was not only possible but essential. It was a lesson that would serve him well throughout his life. Long after the memories of Tom Parker Bowles faded into the distant past where they belonged.